Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So what I want to, I will speak a little bit about the work I've done for the network. Back in 2013, I prepared and I worked closely with Sarah Fontaine on preparing a knowledge synthesis on why do women earn less than men. So these syntheses are available in French and in English. And so before Elizabeth and Mélanie present their work, I just want to go back to this synthesis and see whether it's still um, relevant today, a few years after it was published. And just so the knowledge synthesis series is a product that the network published on different topics. So the idea is to see how the work done by various researchers using data in one of the research data center across Canada, how does that work can inform one question or a policy relevant question. In this case, I think it's very policy relevant, especially today, to look at why do women earn less than men. The approach that I had in this synthesis is that I looked at the issue and look at how the research done can empirically support various hypotheses that can explain why do women earn less than men. So I had four main hypotheses. They're not mutually exclusive. They overlap, but I chose to present them this way. So first hypothesis, women are overrepresented in occupations that are at the low end of the pay scale. We know that even now, diversification of choice, of professional choices among women is much, women are overrepresented in a small number of occupations compared to men. And these occupations tend to be at the lower end of the pay scale. So that's one hypothesis. Second hypothesis, women place a greater value on non-pecuniary aspects of a job. Uh, Third hypothesis, which is really related to the second one, women's greater family responsibilities lead them to choose jobs that allow them to better balance work and life. So they choose some jobs, uh, perhaps because some aspects of their job that are not financial are more important to them. They will tend to opt for jobs that offer a better work-life balance. And the fourth hypothesis is that there are in the workplace gender stereotypes or organizational practices that tend to better value a man's pattern of employment. So what I'll do, I'll from this synthesis, there were a number of lessons learned, of findings, of main findings, and I will go through them and see whether they are still relevant today. One of the main findings of coming out of the synthesis is coming out of a wide body of research on this issue is that there's a large part of the wage gap that is unexplained. So when we look at wage gap and we try to see the differences between men and women in terms of education, in terms of occupation, in terms of industry, a number of factors that are related to that should be related to wage. Taking into account this, there's a large part of the gap that is not explained by this. So we tend to think about it as the unexplained portion of the wage gap. We could also call it discrimination, but among economists, we tend to call it the unexplained portion of the wage gap. After the synthesis was published, there was work by Tammy Shelf published in the Canadian Public Policy where she looks at the unexplained and explained part of the wage gap and look across provinces, what are the differences. So first we see a lot of variation in the wage gap across provinces, where Newfoundland and Labrador has the highest wage gap. So how to read this in Newfoundland and Labrador, women earn 40% less than men, and that the portion that is not explained is 20. So almost half of the gap is unexplained in this province. And then you'd have at the other end Prince Edward Island, where the wage gap is smaller, but it's still a big proportion of the wage gap is unexplained. So saying that there remains a big part of the gap that is unexplained, this is still a finding from the synthesis that is very relevant still now. Another finding is that at the time, what the synthesis would lead me to conclude is that the diversification of educational and occupational choices would do a lot in reducing wage inequality. So at the time, there would seem that at least the progress in the last 20, 30 years in terms of more diversification of occupational choices had led to a reduction in the wage gap. And at the time, we were thinking that in order to close the gap even further, more diversification can do a lot in reducing the gap. But today, after a few research on that, and especially the work by Melissa Moiser from StatsCan in her paper "Women in Paid Work," this conclusion is not as strong. In her research, she shows that the gender pay gap owes largely to wage inequality between women and men within occupations, as opposed to the uneven distribution of women and men across occupations. And so she finds that if women were paid the same wage as men for the same occupation, the wage ratio would go up as much as 97%, so almost parity. So this is how more recent work has moved me away from this assumption or this position that more diversification of occupational choice or educational choice would bring us closer to closing the wage gap. A third finding is that it is very much their role as mothers that penalize women in the labor market. This was a strong finding in 2013 with the body of work that I had reviewed to write the synthesis, and it's very much still so the case today. And the presentation by Mélanie that will follow in a few minutes will convince you that yeah, there is still a maternity penalty. The impact of motherhood on women's wage is still remains as lessened over years, but remains. And finally, another finding was that it's actually difficult to document with empirical work the existence of prejudice or discriminatory practices in the workplace. So there was not a lot of evidence, empirical evidence, to show that these practices were taking place in the workplace and could explain the wage gap. But there's a bit more evidence on this today. On that subject, what I'd like to quote is this paper by Claudia Golden, where she's looking at, okay, we've come a long way. The wage gap is narrowing. Women are more educated than ever before, more educated than men. They have diversified their employment, their occupation to some extent. Now, what do we need to get really closer to eliminating the wage gap? And she's saying that what the last chapter should be is a change in the labor market, especially a change in the labor market that does not there's firms don't have let me say it again. The gender gap pay would be considerably reduced and even vanish if firms did not have so much of an incentive to reward a pattern of work that's more coherent with men's work. So reward individuals who labor long hours and who work particular hours. So this would be, in our view, really where we should look at in terms of making progress from now on, making progress in closing the wage gap. So now, where are we at? There's all kinds of, well, you heard of the glass ceiling, the paper floor, where the paper floor looks at it's the notion that women are more likely to drop out of higher income. The glass ceiling, it's more difficult, so there's an underrepresentation of women at the top. We're talking about the social ladder also, and there's a recent work from France that shows that women more than men are more likely to reach a higher social position than their mother. So women would reach a higher position than their mother, and boys to a lesser extent. So there's work currently doing, there's Marie Conley and Katrinac who are doing work on this very issue with Canadian data. And so I say stay tuned, because I think it's going to be very interesting work using data that are available in the Research Data Center network. As a transition to the presentation by Elizabeth, I just want to show you, and it's Elizabeth who provided me with the numbers. So what's the minimum income to be part of the 1% top earners in 2016? For men, it's $278,000 to be, that's the threshold to go in the top 1% earner, whereas among women, you need only $170,000 to get into the 1%. So there's Elizabeth will tell you a lot more about the differences, the gender differences in the top earners. And now I turn to you, Elizabeth.
All good. I just want to say thank you quickly to Carole, Sarah, and the whole team for inviting me. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about, so I'm really excited to be here today to speak to you about the results from a paper that I published in January. And it's great that we can celebrate International Women's Day together. So thank you very much. Much appreciated. So what I'll do is I'll just provide a quick overview of some of the findings from my paper, which was really the first gender-based analysis of workers in top income groups for Canada. So I'll provide a little bit of the literature, which Carole has already done, and then kind of what motivates the study and what the key findings are. So over the last few decades, we know that income growth for those at the top end of the income distribution has been faster than for the general population or those in bottom income groups. So that means that the top income share has become more important over time. And that's really motivated researchers to look at the characteristics of people in top income groups. How do they differ from the general population? And there's a really great study by Lemieux and Ridel, which looks at the characteristics of the top 1% using census data. And essentially what they found is that high-income Canadians, mainly men, are highly educated. They're more educated than the general population. They're also more likely to work in a few occupations like health or senior management, and they also work longer hours. So we're starting to understand the characteristics of these high-income Canadians. But what about gender? What do we know about the gender differences for women and men in top income groups? And that's really something that researchers are beginning to investigate. We're really starting to see some interesting work in terms of this field and starting to understand what the differences are. There's a study by some researchers in the US. They looked at the characteristics for women and men in top income groups in the United States, and they asked a number of interesting analytical questions. And one of them was the paper floor. So are women still as likely as men, more likely than men, to drop out of top income groups? So say to reach the top 1% and then to fall out of the top 1% in the next year or the next 5 years. And they actually found that yes, the paper floor was important in the 1980s, but it's not as important as it used to be. So really seeing the paper floor disappear over time, which is a really interesting finding. They also find that when they compare lifetime top earners, so people, if you take their entire lifetime earnings, they're in top income groups, the gender gap for women and men is larger in their 30s or 40s. It narrows prior to retirement. And that really speaks to some of the analysis that Mélanie is going to present, really kind of during a decade where there might be some labor market interruption. So some really interesting analysis. Nicole Fortaine at the University of British Columbia is an expert in this field, and she's made a very important contribution to the literature. So in a study that looked at the impact of the underrepresentation of women in top income groups on the gender pay gap. They looked at Canada, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. They found that the underrepresentation explained a large part of the gender pay gap, even when you accounted for age, education, occupation, and industry. And that share of the gap that was explained has been increasing over time. So it's becoming more and more relevant to really look at the characteristics of high income workers and to look at the gender differences. Nicole Fortaine worked with some of my colleagues and they published a really interesting paper yesterday with Aneta Bonikowska and Marie Drolet. So it's a great paper. And what it does is it simulates gender gaps for different scenarios. So say we remove vertical segregation. What happens to the gender pay gap? What if we remove horizontal segregation? What do we see? And what they found is that women not reaching the same income group as men within their current industries has been central to the persistence of the gender pay gap. So these are the studies, the literature that really motivate my paper. So we know about the characteristics of high income Canadians, mainly men. We don't know that much about gender differences, and it's becoming more and more relevant within the context of the gender pay gap to figure out, why women are underrepresented in this field or what's happening. So some of the key questions are, what are the socioeconomic characteristics of working women in top income groups? So say the top 1%. How are they different than men in the same income bracket? Do we see any income differences, any differences in terms of hours of paid or unpaid work? So my paper does focus on the top 1%, which is a relatively small group, and census data allow for a very detailed profile of those socioeconomic characteristics for top income groups. So 2016 census data was used with a comparison to 2006 patterns when relevant to really inform on the evolution of those patterns over time. Total income was selected to determine income thresholds. Total income includes investment income and self-employment income, which are important sources of income for high income Canadians. So it could be physicians, senior executives, business leaders may get a large portion of their income from these sources. So it was important to choose total income. So my study focuses on workers, so those who reported that they were working with a total income of $270,000 or more. I do want to highlight that though the analysis focuses on the top 1%, the paper does present results for the entire income distribution. So for those of you who are interested in doing the analysis yourself, I encourage you to do that. The reason that I picked the top 1%, the trends were similar when looking at the top 5% and the top 1%, but the gender gaps were always wider for the top 1%. This is a group of Canadians that's relatively similar in terms of their education, occupational profile, and there was a very clear storyline to be told here. So please, if you're interested in other income groups, please feel free to consult the study. Women represented 1 in 5 workers in the top 1% in 2015. So that's a total of 35,000 women and 137,000 men who were included in the top 1%. It's important to note that there has been progress over time. So that's up from about 1 in 6 workers in 2005. And we can see that progress for the income groups here selected. So the top 5%, top 1, and the top 0.1%, where very few women made it to the top 0.1%, really the apex of the income distribution. I also want to note that immigrants were relatively well represented in top income groups if we compare to the share of the working population. However, visible minorities and Indigenous people were less represented. So 1 in 7 working women in the top 1% reported a visible minority identity, and that's compared to 1 in 5 in the working population. For Indigenous people represented about 4% of the working population and only about 1% 90% of the top 1%. So in terms of diversity, there's clearly some underrepresentation for these groups, which is important to highlight. Generally, working women in the top 1% were relatively younger than their male counterparts. They also had a higher level of educational attainment, so they were more likely to have a degree above the bachelor's level, to have studied in medicine as well. If we look at workers with at least a bachelor's degree, there's some really important educational gender gaps in terms of the field of study. And the largest or the widest educational gender gap is in architecture, engineering, and related technologies. So regardless of income, throughout the income distribution, we really see that men were more likely than women to have studied in this field. We know that young women continue to be less likely than young men to go into STEM education, and when they do graduate with STEM degrees, again, they're less likely than their male counterparts to actually work in STEM fields. So that's the largest gap, but I also want to highlight a few others. We see men who are more likely to work in business, management, and public administration, while women were more likely than their male counterparts to work in social and behavioral sciences and also health and related fields. And that's really consistent with the patterns that we'll see in terms of occupation. So here we can take a look at the occupational gender gaps. And the widest gaps were observed in management and in health. So we have women who are almost twice as likely as their male counterparts to be working in health fields. And that really speaks to the great strides or notable advancements that women have made in medicine over the last few decades. So that's really an area where we're seeing some progress for women, so increasingly young women going to study in medicine. So women now represent 1 in 2 general doctors, 1 in 3 specialist physicians in Canada. But we are seeing kind of that gender gap at the top end of the income distribution. We also see greater representation of men in terms of natural and applied sciences. So again, speaks to that gap in terms of STEM fields that we saw earlier in terms of education. And I want to flag management. So we have about 41% of men in the top 1% who are working in management compared to about 31% of women. So that's a notable gender gap, and most of it is explained by representation in senior management. If we look at Canada as a whole, 1 in 4 senior managers were women. In the top 1%, that's 1 in 7. So at the higher income levels, we see women even less represented in senior management, which is an important occupation if we look at decision-making and leadership in Canada. I also want to note that these gender gaps have become more entrenched over the last decade. So if we compare these results with 2006, and that's really consistent with what I'm reading in the literature in terms of that occupational gender segregation becoming more entrenched over time. So that's what we're seeing in terms of the results for the top 1%. In terms of family composition, we know from previous studies from my colleagues at StatCan that high-income workers or high-income Canadians are more likely than the general population to be married or in a common law relationship, and also to have children. So although we observe that, for the top 1%, there's some important gender differences. So working women in the top 1% less likely than their male counterparts to be married or in a common law relationship. So about 77% of working women in the top 1% who are married or have a common law spouse, compared to about 88% of their male counterparts. We see that women are more likely than men to be lone mothers, and that's something that was really consistent across the income distribution. If we look at the last category, so persons not in a census family, so women were more likely than their male counterparts to be living alone or with non-family members. And that, interestingly, is the opposite of what we observe for workers in the bottom 90%. So workers with a total income of $105,000 or less. In that category, we see that men are more likely than women to be living alone or with non-related family members. So we see the opposite trend for the top 1%. In terms of children, similar trends, so working women in the top 1% were less likely than their male counterparts to have children, and when they did, they had fewer children. I think you can quickly see from this slide that men were more likely to have 2 or more children. And I want to note that these patterns are consistent for core-aged workers, so workers between 25 and 54 years of age, and they've been relatively unchanged over the last decade, so still observing those gender gaps in the 2006 census data. If we look at gender gaps in terms of income, Carole mentioned this great study by Claudia Golden that looks at basically gender pay gap for different occupations. And what she finds is that the income gaps are wider in occupations with high returns to overwork, and narrower in occupations where the relationship between hours worked and pay is more linear. So say in health fields, where it's a more linear relationship and the penalties for taking time out of the labor market are less severe. So these findings are relevant and they do inform the results that we see for gender gaps in income. So we see some relatively important gender pay gaps for management, business, finance, and administration, some relatively narrower gender gaps for health occupations. When we account for age and for hours worked, we see the gap for natural and applied sciences narrow, while there's very little change if we look at the income gap for management, business, or even health. So just to say there's quite a bit more analysis to be done in terms of this field. I've read some interesting papers for other countries, really trying to kind of dig into those pay gaps for executives. There was an interesting study published by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives that essentially looked at the executive pay gap for executives in the very top, I think it was the top few hundred of public corporations in Canada, kind of looking at the impact of firm size, looking at different indicators, characteristics to really explain the gender pay gap in terms of executives. And the study found that there's still quite a bit that's unexplained. So there's still more that we can kind of learn about the executive pay gap. If we look at average hours worked, so we know that high-income Canadians are more likely to work longer hours than the general population, again, with some important gender differences. So for those who were not in a census family, so those who were unattached or those without children, they worked similar hours. So they worked about 46 hours, both women and men. Where we see differences when workers had children or when they were married or in a common law relationship. So we see here working women in the top 1% who were married or in a common law relationship worked an average of 42 hours, 5 hours less than their male counterparts, and it's similar for those with 1 or 2 children. The trends are also interesting. So working women in the top 1%, hours worked declined as the number of children increased, whereas generally it's the opposite trend that we observe for men. So working men in the top 1%, the more children they had, it seemed the more hours that they worked. And I'll give you a more extreme example. So for working women and men in the top 1% with 4 or 5 children, women worked an average of 38 hours compared to 48 hours for men. So those gender gaps become even wider the more children are kind of coming into play. And that really begs the question, what's happening in terms of the division of work in households? And some of my colleagues at Statistics Canada have done some very interesting studies, so looking at unpaid work within households. So while fathers are contributing more in terms of housework and childcare, if we compare to the mid-1980s, mothers are continuing to contribute the bulk of unpaid work. And that's what I'm seeing here in terms of the 2006 data. So just to note, this analysis does come from the 2006 census. We didn't have the data available for 2016, but given that there's been very little change in terms of family composition and number of children for this group, this is valuable analysis which informs our understanding of what's happening. So major gender gaps. So we see some differences, women being twice as likely as their male counterparts to spend 15 hours or more on housework. And again, for those with children, women, almost 45% of them spending 15 hours or more on children compared to about 25% for their male counterparts. So some important gender differences in terms of unpaid work as well. Just to quickly wrap up, we can see from this analysis that women have taken a different path than men in terms of reaching top income groups. We've noted some really important occupational gender gaps, women being more likely to be working in health, typically as physicians, men more likely to work in management, especially at senior levels. And we're seeing those occupational gender gaps becoming more entrenched over time if we compare to data from 2006. There were also some differences in terms of family status and number of children where we're also not seeing much movement, working women less likely to be in a couple than their male counterparts, or to have children and to have fewer children when they did. These family dynamics are reflected if we take a look at hours worked, with working women in the top 1% and their male counterparts working similar hours if they didn't have any children or if they were unattached. Where we see those gender differences, it's for those in couples or those with children. And finally, some wider gender pay gaps for management, for business compared to health. So all of this to say, it suggests that there's different challenges or different paths for women that are taking, that are going into health, going into medicine, in terms of a path to high income groups versus business and management, some different challenges for women. So I hope that informs our discussion later on, and I'm looking forward to questions.
So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Sarah and Carole, again for the invitation and the whole Canadian Research Data Center. Also, I'm sorry, I'm more comfortable in French than in English, but I'll try to do my best. So, the paper I'm going to present is about the effect of children on the parents' income. And this is jointly work with Marie Connolly and Catherine Egg, professors of economics at UQAM. And the title of the paper is The Motherhood Pay Gap in Canada, Trend, Geographical Patterns, and the Link with Family-Friendly Policies. So quickly, what we learn about the literature on the gender pay gap is that there is a reduction of the gender pay gap in earnings over time, and that is mostly due to important demographic and social changes that occur the last decades, like the increase in women's participation in the labor market, the educational progress of women, but also the declining fertility rates. Today, women have fewer children, which is also more compatible with a professional career. And also the legislative and political changes, such as longer parental leave and with a job protection and a better and a more affordable childcare program. But since the 19th, this convergence of the gender pay gap is stagnating, and one hypothesis of that raised in the literature of the persistence of this gap is the parenthood. And if we look at this graph that link parenthood and gender pay gap, here I plot the trajectories of men and women across time, and I also separated it about the parental stages. What we see is that the gender pay gap is more important between parents than between individuals without children. So one hypothesis behind these patterns is that there is a specialization between parents couple. Father specialized in paid work, while mother specialized in unpaid work and childcare and domestic responsibilities. So it seems that parenthood is correlated or associated with lower wage for mother and fewer wages for, greater wages for men. So this phenomenon is called the family gap in the literature, and it measures the wage gap differential between parents and non-parents. And the literature, the economic literature state that motherhood is associated with lower wages, and this phenomenon is called the motherhood penalty, while fatherhood is associated with higher wages, and this is called the fatherhood premium. So some empirical evidence of the family gap across world. We see that in the United States, a recent paper states that the motherhood penalty is about 7.5% for mothers with 2 children and more, but no significant gap for a mother with only 1 child. And this gap have decreased across time. In France, there is a motherhood pay gap of around 4% and 10% for mother of 2 and 3 children and more respectively in the private sector, and no significant gap in the public sector. So in Denmark, there is no significant penalty, and it's also the case in most of Scandinavian countries. Like they have advanced family policies. But what about the situation in Canada? So to our knowledge, there is only 2 papers that focused on this issue, specifically on with the Canadian data. And the first one was published in 2001 by Phipps and her co-author. So they estimate a motherhood pay gap of around 12.5% once their control for human capital variable and time spent out of the labor market. That is still important. And also, they're focusing on a subgroup of women, those who return to the same job after their maternity leave, and they found no significant gap for those women. And the other paper was published in 2010. So he used longitudinal data, and he found, so he estimates the difference in earnings between women and childless women several years after the childbirth and several years before and after. And he found a motherhood penalty of about 40% in the year of the childbirth that totally disappears 7 years after. So here is some hypotheses behind the motherhood pay gap. So first of all, there is the depreciation of human capital that can occur in 2 ways, non-accumulation and deterioration. The non-accumulation is the fact that women have to withdraw from the labor market to childbearing, so they accumulated less human capital compared to other women. There is also the fact that mother will choose more family-friendly employment jobs, and we know that is also less paid a job. After those, mothers are less productive due to responsibility, to family responsibility. So today, mother and in general, women support most important cost of the responsibilities. So they have to balance their family work and their responsibility in the family and in the works. There is also the employers' discrimination. There is an interesting paper published in 2007 using American data. And researchers send hundreds of CV of a resume. The resume was exactly the same, except based on 2 characteristics, the sex and the parental status. And what they found is that, first of all, women with children were less called back than women without children. And conversely, fake men with children were called back more often than men without children. So there is also the unobserved heterogeneity, which is the fact that individual who decide to have children are not the same as individual who decide to not have kids. So there are different person in terms of abilities or preferences, and they will make different choice in terms of education that can affect their future earnings. So the data we use for the analysis is a Canadian study, the longitudinal and international study of adult, the LISA. We use the first three rays available at the RDC. So the sample is composed by a permanent member. So individuals selected in the wave 1, and they are interviewed every 2 years. And in the subsequent year, actually, they add their future children and the new household member. So there is a core content across the wave. So we have a lot of questions about labor market, education, training skills, and family experience. So we can identify the presence of children in each household. The other advantage of this data is that the survey is linked with several administrative data sources. So we can have the historical data of personal and family earnings, transfer income, and before and after tax income of each individual in the survey, dating back 1982. And we also have historical data of earnings and employers dating back 2000. So the sample is composed of a balanced panel of parents. So we only keep parents that we observe every year between 5 years before and 10 years after the childbirth of their first kids. We also keep parents who gave birth between 1987 and 2005, and who gave birth between 20 and 40-year-olds. So this leads us with a sample of about 3,000 mothers and 3,000 fathers distributed through all provinces in Canada. And for the childless men and women, we build counterfactuals using matching method, but assigning each childless man and woman with a parent based on the same characteristics. And this leads us to a sample of about 1,700 women in men without children. So for the methodology, we use an event study analysis. So actually, the parameter of interest here is the beta 2. So it's a set of dummy variable for the time before and after the first childbirth. We control for age fixed effect, time fixed effect, and in some model, individual fixed effect. We keep the income of the outcome of interest in level rather than in log to be able to keep the zero in our regression. So after that, we convert the coefficient, the estimated coefficient, into percentage by dividing each estimated coefficient, you see here, beta 2, by the average predicted outcome of the equation 1 when we omitted the contribution of the event time t. So this is the result of our baseline model. So the first graph here represents the model without fixed effect, individual fixed effects. And the second one, we add fixed effects. So the dotted red line represents the coefficient for a mother, and the solid blue line represents the coefficient for father. And what we see in the two models is that the year before the first childbirth, men and women have the same trajectories of earnings, but once the first child arrives, the income of mother falls dramatically, and nothing seems appear to the trajectories of fathers. If we look at the regression by region, here I plot the province of Quebec by the dotted blue line. We see that the province of Quebec has a different patterns than the rest of the Canada. It could be explained by the fact that in Quebec the fertility rate is lower than in the rest of the Canada. So if we neutralize the effect of children and only look at the mother with only one child, we see the same patterns for Quebec. So we have to search for a more causal explanation behind these results. And we looked at the family policies that we have in Quebec and in Canada more generally. So in 2001, the government federal, there is a reform on the parental leave. And in Quebec, in 1997, the government of Quebec launched a program on the subsidized daycare. And in 2006, the province of Quebec creates its own Quebec parental insurance plan, which are more advantageous than the federal plan. And if we look at the methodology used for this policy analysis, so the first model, we just evaluate the effect of the federal reform, and we look at the earning trajectories of mothers who gave birth before their first birth, before 2001 and after. And in the second model, actually, we look at the effects of the combined policy in Quebec. So this is the results of the first regression. So the effect, the policy effect occurs in 2001. And what we see is that this policy seems to have positive impact of trajectories of earnings of women. But if we exclude Quebec in that regression, we have no effects anymore. So our hypothesis is that not only her higher parental leave help women in the labor market, but also the combined effect with available and affordable childcare. And this is the results here that confirm that hypothesis. Here in a dotted blue line, we have the earning trajectories of mothers who gave birth after 2001 in Quebec. And we see that the patterns is different than the others. So quickly, to conclude, we effectively found that motherhood has a negative effect on women's wage, and that earning trajectories of fathers are not affected by children. Our results suggest that there is important difference between Quebec and the other regions in Canada, and there are possibly a link between the family-friendly policies in Quebec and the better situation in Quebec in terms of earnings. That's conclude my presentation. So thank you.